German armored doctrine was built on clear battlefield hierarchies that separated threats from non-threats. And within this system, trucks occupied the lowest tier of concern. Panzer crews were trained to identify and respond first to anti-tank guns, field artillery, and opposing armored vehicles, because these were the assets capable of stopping or destroying mechanized formations. Soft-skinned transport vehicles, even when moving close to operational zones, they were categorized as logistical enablers rather than combat actors, and their presence rarely triggered immediate tactical concern. German planning frameworks emphasized speed, armor protection, and firepower as decisive battlefield factors, which meant any platform lacking these attributes was assumed to be strategically irrelevant during direct engagements. Supply trucks were expected to remain behind the forward line of contact, supporting ammunition movement, fuel distribution, or troop transport, and were not viewed as systems capable of influencing combat outcomes. Even when trucks appeared near contested sectors, they were interpreted as signs of reinforcement or resupply activity rather than potential offensive capability. Training materials and operational briefings reinforced this perception by focusing attention on tracked vehicles, fortified positions, and artillery signatures, not leaving little room to consider that a wheeled transport platform might serve as an independent strike element. German crews were conditioned to evaluate threats through visual cues such as armor profile, turret presence, and weapon barrel silhouette. And since trucks presented none of these features, they were often filtered out of immediate threat assessments. This mindset shaped decision-making at both the tactical and command levels, leading to engagement priorities that excluded unarmored mobility platforms from defensive planning. Reconnaissance reports rarely flagged truck concentrations as indicators of impending attack, and countermeasures were not allocated to neutralize them. The assumption that mobility, without armor, equaled vulnerability became embedded in battlefield expectations, reinforcing the belief that trucks could be ignored until higher priority targets were addressed. As a result, when American transport vehicles began operating in proximity to armored formations, German units interpreted their presence through an established framework that treated them as harmless logistical background rather than active components of combat operations. This perception gap set the stage for a miscalculation because it created a blind spot within German threat evaluation processes. By assigning trucks to a non-combat category, the German forces inadvertently lowered their vigilance toward a platform that would soon be used in a way that did not fit existing doctrinal assumptions. The belief that trucks were incapable of delivering meaningful battlefield impact allowed them to move with less scrutiny, reducing the likelihood of preemptive action against them. In this environment, any adaptation that turned mobility into a delivery mechanism for offensive capability could operate within a window of tactical surprise, precisely because it exploited a deeply rooted expectation about what constituted a threat. The first indications that American truck formations were behaving outside expected logistical patterns emerged during fast-moving engagements where German armored units anticipated rear area support activity rather than forward maneuver. Observers began reporting clusters of U.S. transport vehicles operating closer to contested zones than standard doctrine would suggest, often maintaining spacing and movement discipline more typical of combat elements than supply convoys. Instead of dispersing when confronted by advancing armor or indirect fire, these trucks adjusted position in coordinated shifts, using terrain folds, tree lines, and urban cover in ways that implied tactical intent rather than routine movement. Their presence was initially rationalized as preparation for rapid reinforcement or ammunition transfer, but their refusal to retreat under pressure created uncertainty within German forward elements. In several encounters, trucks appeared in staggered intervals rather than continuous columns, suggesting a deliberate approach to positioning rather than the urgency associated with resupply missions. This pattern contradicted established expectations because logistics vehicles were expected to withdraw quickly when exposed to threat environments. German crews noted that some of these vehicles halted briefly in open or semi-protected zones before repositioning, as if awaiting timing rather than seeking concealment. The behavior resembled staging rather than transit, which complicated the standard categorization of trucks as passive assets. Reports from reconnaissance units indicated that these formations occasionally advanced alongside infantry screening elements, an arrangement that blurred the boundary between logistical and operational roles. The absence of visible artillery pieces or armored escort initially led to the assumption that the trucks were part of flexible support operations, but their persistence near active engagement lines suggested a different function. The vehicles also demonstrated a willingness to move laterally across sectors, rather than simply forward or backward along supply routes, indicating that they were being used to shape positioning rather than maintain supply continuity. German units observed that these movements often occurred in proximity to upcoming armored clashes, as if synchronized with broader maneuver plans. Despite these anomalies, the visual profile of the trucks remained unchanged, offering no immediate indication of enhanced capability. Without armor plating or prominent weapon systems, they continued to appear structurally identical to standard transport platforms. This visual familiarity reinforced the inclination to treat them as background assets, even as their operational behavior diverged from expectations. The truck's ability to blend into the logistical landscape reduced the urgency of immediate response, allowing them to maintain forward presence without triggering engagement priorities. This early phase of observation marked a transition from certainty to ambiguity, as German crews began to register that something about these formations did not align with established patterns of supply movement. The discrepancy between appearance and behavior introduced a subtle tension in battlefield interpretation, because it hinted at a capability that had not yet been identified. Behind their familiar transport silhouette, certain American trucks had been adapted to carry multiple rocket launch systems that were engineered for rapid deployment and withdrawal, rather than sustained firing from fixed positions. Standard cargo beds were modified with mounting frames that supported banks of launch rails, allowing unguided rockets to be discharged in short, concentrated bursts. The design emphasized simplicity and speed, using lightweight structures that could be installed without extensive changes to the vehicle's core mechanics. This approach preserved the truck's mobility while adding a temporary strike function that did not rely on armor protection. Launch assemblies were aligned to permit elevation adjustments, enabling area coverage rather than precision targeting, and the absence of heavy stabilization equipment meant the system could be operated with minimal setup time. Electrical ignition circuits were integrated to allow near simultaneous firing across multiple rails, creating a dense saturation effect within seconds. Ammunition was stored in compact configurations that balanced payload with maneuverability, ensuring the vehicle could reposition quickly after discharge. The integration process avoided permanent conversion where possible, allowing trucks to be returned to transport roles if required, which maintained logistical flexibility. From a distance, the launch frames were difficult to distinguish when stowed or covered, contributing to the platform's ability to appear unchanged during movement. The system's effectiveness relied less on individual rocket accuracy and more on cumulative impact, using volume to compensate for dispersion. By mounting the launch capability on wheeled platforms, American planners enabled these systems to accompany advancing units across varied terrain without the constraints associated with towed artillery. The lack of heavy recoil reduced structural stress on the vehicle, making repeated use feasible within operational limits. Firing sequences could be executed rapidly, after which the truck could relocate before counter-battery measures were organized. This mobility contrasted with traditional rocket artillery, which typically required more static deployment. The concealed nature of the installation meant that visual identification alone did not reveal the truck's altered role, allowing them to approach operational zones without drawing attention reserved for overt weapon systems. In practice, the hidden design transformed a non-threatening platform into a transient strike asset that operated within the logistical profile of a transport vehicle while delivering effects associated with indirect fire support. This duality allowed the system to exploit assumptions about truck vulnerability, while introducing a capability that was not immediately recognized through standard visual assessment. American planners did not deploy rocket-equipped trucks as substitutes for artillery or as precision anti-armor systems, but rather as mobile disruption tools designed to alter battlefield tempo before direct engagements began. Their tactical purpose was rooted in speed, surprise, and temporary fire dominance within localized zones. Instead of positioning these systems behind established firing lines, they were moved forward in coordination with maneuver elements, allowing them to operate within windows where enemy formations were assembling or repositioning. The truck's wheeled mobility enabled them to access routes and terrain features that were impractical for heavier rocket artillery units, particularly in fluid engagements where front lines were not fixed. Once in position, the launchers could deliver rapid salvos intended to saturate a defined area, rather than target individual assets. But this method produced immediate psychological and operational disruption, as the sudden volume of incoming fire forced enemy units to halt movement, seek cover, or reorient formations. The rockets were typically fired just prior to armored advances or infantry pushes, creating a temporary zone of instability that reduced organized resistance during the critical opening moments of an assault. Because the trucks could reposition quickly after firing, though they avoided becoming stationary targets for counter-battery response. This mobility allowed repeated use across different sectors within short time frames, extending their influence beyond a single engagement. American forces often coordinated these deployments with reconnaissance updates, ensuring that salvos were timed against enemy concentration points rather than dispersed formations. The truck's ability to move alongside advancing elements also meant that their fire support could be applied closer to evolving objectives than traditional artillery would permit. In some operations, they were used to simulate the presence of heavier bombardment, compelling enemy units to interpret the attack as the opening phase of a larger artillery strike. This misinterpretation increased hesitation and delayed counteraction. The tactical logic emphasized disruption rather than destruction, recognizing that even limited structural damage could produce disproportionate effects if delivered at decisive moments. By integrating rocket trucks into maneuver sequences, American commanders created a flexible tool that bridged the gap between mobility and indirect fire support. The vehicles did not replace existing systems, but complemented them by introducing a capability that could be applied rapidly and withdrawn just as quickly. This approach leveraged timing over accuracy, using brief bursts of saturation to influence movement and decision-making rather than relying on sustained bombardment. The result was a method of battlefield shaping that operated within the tempo of mechanized warfare, enabling forces to impose momentary imbalance without committing heavier assets prematurely. The first operational use of rocket-equipped trucks produced effects that German units initially struggled to interpret because the incoming fire did not match the characteristics of conventional artillery. Salvos arrived rapidly and in dense clusters, creating blast patterns that resembled heavy bombardment, yet lacked the sustained rhythm typically associated with fixed batteries. This sudden concentration of explosions forced armored and infantry elements to react immediately, often interrupting planned advances or defensive positioning. The speed at which the rockets were delivered compressed reaction time, leaving little opportunity for units to identify the source before adjusting movement or seeking cover. Unlike artillery barrages that could be anticipated through sound ranging or spotting, these strikes appeared with minimal warning, contributing to confusion about their origin. In several encounters, the impact zone extended across staging areas where vehicles were assembling for maneuver, disrupting coordination before engagement had fully begun. German crews reported difficulty distinguishing between preparatory bombardment and spontaneous attack, which complicated command decisions about whether to advance, hold position, or withdraw. The rocket's dispersion pattern created overlapping blast effects that interfered with communication lines and visual observation, reducing the ability of commanders to maintain situational awareness during critical moments. Because the launch platforms were mobile, the strikes did not correlate with identifiable artillery positions, preventing immediate counter-battery response. This disconnect between effect and source generated uncertainty about the scale of the threat, as the volume of fire suggested larger systems than were actually involved. In some cases, all armored units halted movement under the assumption that they were entering pre-sighted artillery zones, only to find that the bombardment ceased as abruptly as it began. The temporary nature of the strikes further complicated assessment, as the absence of follow-up fire suggested relocation rather than depletion. This unpredictability forced German formations to reconsider timing and spacing, slowing advances and increasing caution during approach to contested terrain. Even when physical damage to armored vehicles was limited, the disruption to movement patterns created delays that influenced engagement sequencing. Units accustomed to confronting fixed artillery were now encountering fire that appeared and disappeared in short intervals, making traditional defensive drills less effective. The immediate impact was therefore less about destruction and more about disorganization. As formations were compelled to adjust under pressure without clear understanding of the threat's origin. This initial experience demonstrated that the integration of mobility with saturation fire could produce operational effects disproportionate to the system's size, particularly when applied at moments of concentration or transition. After the initial engagements demonstrated that rocket-equipped trucks could disrupt movement and decision cycles, their use expanded from isolated trials into coordinated application across multiple sectors. American units began integrating these mobile launch platforms into broader operational plans, positioning them not as replacements for artillery, but as complementary tools that could be deployed rapidly in response to emerging opportunities. Commanders recognized that the truck's effectiveness depended on timing and placement rather than sustained firepower, and this insight shaped how they were distributed among advancing formations. Instead of concentrating them in single units, launch-capable vehicles were assigned in smaller groups that could operate independently, allowing simultaneous disruption across different points of contact. This dispersion increased the likelihood that German units would encounter unexpected salvos without prior warning. As experience grew, coordination between reconnaissance elements and rocket truck crews improved, enabling strikes to be aligned with moments when enemy formations were assembling, refueling, or preparing to maneuver. The truck's ability to relocate quickly meant that they could influence successive engagements within a short time frame, extending their operational reach beyond a single battle phase. In some operations, they were used sequentially to create a pattern of intermittent disruption that prevented opposing forces from settling into stable defensive arrangements. Their mobility also allowed them to accompany advances into newly contested areas, providing immediate support without waiting for heavier systems to be emplaced. This flexibility proved particularly valuable in fluid environments where front lines shifted rapidly and opportunities for localized advantage appeared briefly. As reports of their impact circulated within American command structures, logistical adjustments were made to ensure adequate rocket supply and maintenance support, enabling more consistent deployment. The presence of these systems in multiple engagements gradually normalized their role within tactical planning, moving them from experimental status to an established component of combined operations. German units began encountering similar disruption patterns in different regions, reinforcing the perception that the phenomenon was not isolated, but systemic. This repetition increased uncertainty, as the same type of unexpected fire appeared under varying conditions, suggesting adaptability rather than coincidence. The spread of rocket truck use therefore extended their influence from singular surprise events into a recurring factor that had to be considered during planning and movement. Over time, this distribution across engagements amplified their cumulative effect, shaping how opposing forces approach terrain, timing, and concentration of assets. As encounters with rocket-equipped trucks became more frequent, German command structures were forced to reassess how these platforms fit within the existing threat framework. Initial confusion gave way to attempts at classification, yet the systems did not align neatly with known categories of artillery or armored support. Reports from frontline units described incoming fire that resembled short-duration bombardment without the persistence expected from conventional batteries. And this inconsistency complicated doctrinal response. Commanders attempted to determine whether the rockets were being launched from hidden fixed positions or from mobile sources, and the absence of identifiable artillery signatures suggested the latter. This realization introduced a new layer of uncertainty, because mobility implied that counter-battery measures might not be effective. Traditional responses relied on locating firing positions and suppressing them through indirect fire. But the rapid relocation of launch platforms reduced the window in which such actions could be executed. German units experimented with adjusting movement patterns to minimize exposure during assembly phases, increasing dispersion to reduce the impact of saturation strikes. However, this adaptation carried trade-offs, as wider spacing complicated coordination and reduced concentration of force during maneuver. Intelligence efforts sought to identify distinguishing features that could reveal which trucks were equipped with launch systems, yet the minimal visual differences limited the success of this approach. Air reconnaissance was tasked with locating clusters that might indicate preparation for rocket deployment, but the same mobility that enabled surprise also allowed the vehicles to blend into routine transport traffic. Some formations prioritized targeting any forward-moving truck groups in hopes of neutralizing potential launch platforms before use, though this risked diverting attention from higher priority threats. Tactical instructions were updated to emphasize rapid response drills when sudden bombardment occurred, encouraging units to maintain readiness for brief but intense fire episodes. Despite these measures, the unpredictability of rocket truck deployment continued to challenge planning assumptions. The need to account for mobile saturation fire introduced additional complexity into operational decision-making, as commanders now had to consider the possibility of disruption even in areas not previously associated with artillery risk. This adjustment influenced how German units approached terrain selection, staging, and timing, reflecting a gradual shift from dismissal to caution in their evaluation of truck-based activity. The continued use of rocket-equipped trucks introduced a tactical variable that gradually altered how armored formations approached engagement zones and operational timing. Their presence did not replace traditional artillery or armored firepower, but it inserted a layer of uncertainty into movement and concentration decisions. German units, which had previously relied on predictable threat patterns, they now faced the possibility that disruption could originate from platforms that were visually indistinguishable from logistical assets. This forced a reassessment of staging procedures, as assembling vehicles in tight formations carried increased risk of sudden saturation strikes. The need to account for mobile rocket fire influenced how commanders selected terrain for regrouping, often prioritizing dispersion and concealment over speed of assembly. This adjustment affected maneuver tempo, as additional caution slowed transitions between phases of operation. The unpredictability of launch timing also complicated coordination between armored and infantry elements, because brief but intense bombardment could interrupt synchronization at critical moments. Even when physical damage was limited, the necessity to halt or reorient under unexpected fire reduced momentum and extended exposure to subsequent engagement risks. American forces, meanwhile, were able to exploit these hesitations by aligning rocket truck deployment with advancing maneuvers, amplifying the disruptive effect without committing heavier resources. Over time, the cumulative impact of these interactions reshaped localized engagement dynamics, introducing a pattern in which mobility-based fire support influenced decision cycles rather than relying solely on destructive capacity. German planning increasingly incorporated the possibility that non-armored vehicles might deliver indirect fire effects, prompting broader threat evaluation beyond traditional categories. This shift extended to reconnaissance priorities, with greater attention paid to forward-moving transport formations that might previously have been ignored. The requirement to maintain readiness against sudden area bombardment altered how units approached both offensive and defensive operations, embedding flexibility into response planning. While the rocket trucks did not determine outcomes independently, their integration into maneuver sequences demonstrated that combining mobility with saturation fire could influence battlefield behavior in ways disproportionate to system size. The resulting adjustment in movement discipline, spacing, and timing reflected a subtle but meaningful evolution in how mechanized forces accounted for indirect fire delivered from unconventional platforms.